EVO. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't announce itself as an ending. No collapse, no final moment where everything gives way at once, no clear line between what was and what will no longer be. Instead, there's a slowing, a hesitation that settles into the work, into the structure, into the quiet understanding among those closest to it that something essential has shifted. The machinery doesn't break, the idea isn't disproven, the vision remains intact and unchanged in the mind of the man who conceived it. But the momentum is gone. And without momentum, even the most ambitious constructions begin to feel less like inevitabilities and more like questions waiting to be answered by someone else. At Wardenclyffe, the Tesla Tower stood against the sky with a kind of patient defiance, its wooden frame braced against the wind, its spherical crown poised as though it were still preparing to complete the task for which it had been designed. Beneath it, the earth had already been opened and shaped to receive currents that had yet to be sent. The design was not theoretical. It was present, embodied in timber and steel and the accumulated labor of men who believed they were building something that would endure. And yet, for all its presence, the tower had begun to fall out of alignment with the world around it. Not because it couldn't work, but because the conditions required for it to matter were no longer being met. There are ideas that demand a particular environment to survive. They require not only belief, but support, not only possibility, but continuity. And when those conditions begin to erode, again, not abruptly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the idea itself doesn't fail. It waits. And in waiting, it begins to reveal something that's easy to overlook when we focus only on whether something is true or false. That truth, on its own, isn't always enough. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to What We Built and What We Buried, Episode 6, The Cost of Free Energy. In the last episode, we followed Nikola Tesla as he moved from vision to construction, from the abstract idea of wireless transmission to the physical reality of Wardenclyffe Tower, a structure that stood not just as an experiment, but as a declaration that the system of wires and meters that defined electricity could be replaced. We followed that idea to the moment where it encountered something it couldn't easily overcome. And it wasn't a limitation of physics. It was a question of structure. And tonight we step into what followed. Not the collapse, the withdrawal. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand why Tesla's greatest idea was never fully tested. And it wasn't because it was thought to be impossible and not because it was ever disproven, but because the world into which it emerged couldn't find a place for it without undoing the very system that it depended on. If you're still listening to the series, make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts or on the EVO Creative YouTube channel. Because tonight is where the story moves beyond invention and into the decisions that determine what survives in our culture. As I mentioned last episode, I'm reading some T.S. Eliot concurrently with the creation of this series, and there's this severity in his work that resists any easy resolution, a way of returning to the same question from different angles until the answer begins to dissolve into something less certain, less stable, and more reflective of the complexity that it attempts to describe. Eliot wrote of endings not as events, but as conditions, states that emerge gradually, shaped by forces that are rarely visible in the moment they exert their influence. That sensibility belongs here, because what we're about to examine isn't the failure of an idea, it's the condition that prevents it from continuing. Chapter 4 of our story begins now. The withdrawal of possibility. The support that allowed Wardenclyffe to rise didn't disappear all at once. It slowly diminished. At first, the changes were subtle, delays in funding, questions that lingered longer than expected, a shift in tone that suggested caution where there had once been confidence. These were not unusual developments in a project of this scale. Large ideas, always encounter resistance as they move from conception to realization. And Tesla, who had navigated both action and skepticism throughout his career, was no stranger to that uncertainty. But somehow this was different, because the uncertainty didn't come from doubt about the idea. It came from a growing recognition of what that idea implied. As the full scope of Tesla's vision became clear, as it extended beyond communication and into the transmission of power without wires, the nature of the project began to shift in the eyes of those who had the ability to sustain it. It was no longer a question of whether the tower could be completed. They knew it could be completed. It was a question of what would follow if it were. A system of wireless energy? Gosh, if it were realized at scale, it wouldn't simply coexist within the infrastructure that had already been built. It would challenge it and probably destroy it. It would render certain elements of that infrastructure unnecessary at the very least, and secondarily, in ways that could not be easily reconciled with the economic structures that supported them. Electricity, as it had come to be understood, wasn't just a force. It was a system of relationships between producer and consumer, between distribution and control, between measurement and value. Remove the wires. You don't simply change how energy moves. You change how it's accounted for, how it's monetized, if it could be monetized. And in that change, the question that had been posed earlier, almost as an aside, begins to take on a different angle. Where do we put the meter? You don't. It's no longer a technical question. It's a structural one, because the meter isn't simply a device. It's a point of definition, a place where usage becomes measurable, where consumption becomes billable, where energy enters into the system that assigns it value. Without that point, the relationship between energy and economy begins to dissolve into something far less stable, if there's any stability left. And for Tesla, this dissolution wasn't a problem. It was the goal. But for those who operated within the system as it existed, it introduced a level of uncertainty that couldn't easily be absorbed. The withdrawal of support didn't require confrontation, just hesitation. Again, the funding slowed, commitments softened. The continuity that large-scale projects depend upon began to break down in ways that couldn't be traced to any single decision, but were nevertheless decisive in their effect. Work continued, sure, for a while, under increasingly constrained conditions. Materials became harder to secure, labor became less consistent. The tower, which had once been a symbol of forward motion, began to feel suspended, caught between what it had been intended to become and what it could realistically achieve. And then, eventually, everything stopped. Not with a collapse, not with a declaration of failure, just an absence of continuation. The structure remained, but its purpose had been interrupted. The process by which it might have proven itself had been deferred. And in that deferral, something essential was lost. Because ideas of this scale don't survive indefinitely in a state of suspension. They require completion and demonstration and the transition from possibility into reality. Without that final transition, they begin to recede. And it's not immediate or complete all at once. It's painfully gradual as the world around them continues to move forward along paths that remain supported and remain funded and are aligned with the systems that sustain them. Wardenclyffe didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, a structure without a function, a declaration without a conclusion. In that lingering, it revealed something easy to overlook when we focus only on whether an idea is true. That truth, without alignment, isn't enough to carry something into the world. It must also be allowed to continue. And when that permission's withdrawn, not explicitly, but through the quiet mechanisms that govern support and continuation, the idea doesn't fail. It simply stops. Chapter 5. The Afterlife of an Idea. What follows the stopping of a project like Wardenclyffe isn't silence, it's dispersal. Ideas don't end in the same way that structures do. Timber can be dismantled, steel can be repurposed. A tower can be reduced to materials that no longer carry the intention that once shaped them. But the thinking that produced that structure, Once articulated, once imagined in full, it doesn't disappear so cleanly. It fragments, it migrates, it settles into different contexts, sometimes recognized, often not. Tesla didn't abandon his vision when the tower stopped. He continued to write, to lecture, to describe a world in which energy could be transmitted without wires, in which the Earth itself could serve as part of the circuit, in which the limitations imposed by infrastructure could be bypassed rather than refined. His later work carried the same underlying conviction, even as the conditions required to realize it receded further from reach. But the absence of demonstration began to reshape how those ideas were received. Without a working system, without a completed tower that could validate the scale of what he had proposed, Tesla's vision became easier to reclassify, not as an imminent reality, but as speculation. The same qualities that had once made his thinking seem visionary began to make it appear distant and abstract, increasingly detached from the systems that had continued to develop in his absence. And meanwhile, the world didn't pause. Electrical infrastructure expanded along the lines that had already been established. Power plants multiplied. Transmission networks grew more complex, more efficient, more deeply integrated into the fabric of modern life. The system that Tesla had sought to bypass didn't remain static. It evolved, strengthening the very structures his work had called into question. In that evolution, something else occurred. Certain elements of Tesla's research, his work with high-frequency currents, with resonance, with the behavior of electrical fields, they were absorbed into the broader development of electrical engineering. They didn't disappear. They were refined, adapted, incorporated into technologies that aligned with the existing system. But the central idea, the removal of the system itself, that didn't follow. It remained where Wardenclyffe had left it, unfinished. And in that unfinished state, it began to take on a different kind of life. Stories formed around it. Interpretations diverged. Some saw in Tesla's work the outline of a future that had been interrupted, a possibility that had not been allowed to reach completion. Others saw the limits of an idea that had extended beyond what could be realized, a vision that, while compelling, had not accounted for the constraints of the world it sought to change. Both interpretations persist, because the absence of a definitive outcome leaves space for both. This is the afterlife of an idea that doesn't resolve. It becomes a point of reference rather than a point of arrival, a question that continues to be asked. And in that ongoing uncertainty, the story of Tesla's wireless energy does something that completed inventions rarely do. It remains open, existing as a possibility that continues to press against the boundaries of what is accepted, inviting reconsideration without ever fully demanding it. Which is why, even now, long after the tower has been dismantled and the world has committed itself to a different path, the question doesn't disappear. It lingers. Not whether Tesla was right in every detail, but whether something of what he imagined still lies just beyond the edge of what we have chosen to build. Chapter 6. The Limits We Accept. In the years after Wardenclyffe fell silent, the world didn't pause to reconsider what had been left behind. It moved forward with a confidence that comes from continuity, from systems that reinforce themselves through use, through repetition, through the accumulation of infrastructure that becomes so embedded in daily life it no longer feels constructed at all. Wires stretched further, power stations grew more powerful, the grid, once an innovation, became an assumption. And within that expansion, something subtle occurred. The question Tesla had raised, whether energy needed to be delivered at all, didn't disappear. It just lost its urgency. It became less of a challenge to be answered and more of a possibility that hadn't been pursued. The system, having proven itself effective, didn't need to justify its existence. It just needed to continue. And that's how limits take hold, not as declarations, as defaults. What begins as one way of solving a problem becomes, over time, the way that the problem is understood. Alternatives don't vanish, they recede. They remain at the edge of consideration, present but untested, acknowledged but not advanced. Tesla's vision of wireless energy exists in that space. It's not entirely outside the realm of science, Elements of what he explored, like resonance, transmission through fields, the interaction between Earth and the atmosphere, they continue to be studied and refined and applied in ways that align with existing systems. But the full extension of his idea, the removal of wires as the primary means of distribution, that hasn't been realized at scale. And the reason for that absence is not singular. It can't be reduced to a single decision or a single moment in which the future was redirected. It's the result, again, of alignment, of technological feasibility intersecting with economic structure, of possibility encountering the systems that determine how possibility becomes reality. The devil within this story isn't the idea that something was taken. It's the recognition that what survives isn't always what is most possible, but what is most compatible within the structures that sustain it. Tesla's work didn't fail in the conventional sense. It wasn't disproven. It wasn't dismantled in opposition. It was, in a quieter way, just left behind. And in being left behind, it reveals something that extends beyond a single invention. That the world we inhabit is not shaped only by what can be built, but by what can be supported. There's a tendency to look back at figures like Nikola Tesla and see them as outliers, as individuals whose ideas existed just beyond the reach of their time. That framing isn't entirely inaccurate. There are moments in history when vision moves faster than structure, when imagination extends beyond what can be immediately realized. But there's another way to see it, not as a matter of timing, but of alignment. It's a word we're using a lot in this series, because an idea doesn't enter the world simply because it's possible. It enters the world because it fits, because it can be integrated into the systems that already exist, or because those systems are willing to change to accommodate it. And that's a tall order. Tesla's vision required a different kind of change. Not an improvement of the existing system, but a departure from it. And those departures are really difficult, because they don't just introduce new possibilities, they destroy the old ones. They ask questions that don't have easy answers, particularly when those answers would require a redefinition of value and control, and of how something as fundamental as energy is understood. So the idea remains. Not gone, not fully realized, but present in the space between what is and what might have been. And it's in that space that it continues to ask a question that has not yet found a definitive answer. Not whether it could work, but whether it could be allowed to. Next time, we move from energy to motion, from a system that promised to distribute power freely to a machine that claimed it could run without fuel at all. We step into the story of Stanley Meyer, a man who said he had built a car that ran on water. A device that, if real, would have challenged not just an industry, but the foundation of how energy is consumed and valued. It's a story that spread quickly, that drew attention, that drew skepticism and controversy in equal measure. And like the stories before it, it exists at the edge of belief. Because this time, the claim isn't just ambiguous. It's actually dangerous because of what people want it to mean. We'll see you next time on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.